Hello everyone! We are picking up right where our last video left off. In the last video we talked a little bit more about Old English language and linguistics and narrative traditions, and we also talked about two specific literary traditions, being these more kind of game style traditions of kennings and of riddles. And in this video, like I said, we're picking up right where we left off to talk about the two poems that you will read for class this week. So the poems that we read, and in fact also Beowulf and the riddles that we'll have access to as well, all come to us from four major Old English manuscripts. These are the Caedmon manuscript, the Exeter book, the Vercelli book, and the Beowulf manuscript. So if you see anyone talking about these four books, obviously the Beowulf manuscript is self-explanatory, but if you hear these other three names, you'll know immediately that they are discussing Old English surviving extant texts. Now, the Caedmon manuscript is mostly a collection of biblical narrative poems with some religious commentary, and then with a couple of allegorical poems as well. The Exeter book is an anthology of poetry. That's where many of the riddles that we have access to come from. The Vercelli book is both poetry and prose, and again, the Beowulf manuscript is fully self-explanatory. So the two poems that we're going to read are The Seafarer and The Wife's Lament, and they both come to us from the Exeter book. So the Exeter book really is this really rich repository of Old English texts. And so we'll start with The Seafarer here. The Seafarer is the longer of the two poems. It is a little bit beefy, and I don't expect that you will really approach it in the greatest depth. I would like for you to obviously, read it honestly, thoroughly as you can, but it is pretty chewy. There's a lot there to chew on. Now, at the literal level, it's typically interpreted as the reminiscences of an elderly sailor. He is kind of looking back over his life and thinking about the things he's experienced, almost as if he is speaking to a younger compatriot. He spends a great deal of time thinking about the dangers and discomforts of the sea, the weather, the waves, the danger, the storms, and contrasting this with kind of the light and warmth and joy of companionship on land, and really describing how much he misses sort of that sense of companionship. But there are a lot of shifts over the course of the text. The climate around the speaker shifts, sort of moving through the seasons of the year. It goes from being kind of this chilly weather, moving into this really terrible wintry weather, and then moving into spring again. And as the climate around the speaker shifts more towards the winter, so the speaker's attitude shifts to yearning for the sea despite its dangers. And then finally, as the climate around the speaker shifts through into spring again, the speaker begins to give advice about religion and morality, and really ending on this very, very religious note. The last word of the poem is, in fact, the speaker saying, Amen. Now, by the time that this poem was written down, obviously it was in a Christian context. It was written down by a Christian monk. But again, it does seem to come from an older oral tradition, as do all of the things that we seem to be reading this week. And partially because of this, and partially because of the structure of The Seafarer, given all of its kind of shifts and the shifts in tone of the speaker and kind of the setting and climate, there are many thematic interpretations of this text. One of the most common is that it exists as an exemplum, and an exemplum is literally just a sort of medieval Christian way of describing the kind of life that a moral person should live. The story also gets pretty heavily into the concept of fate versus choice, where the seafarer seems to believe that his life is kind of already laid out for him. His life is fated to go in a certain direction, specifically fated to go in a certain direction by God. Another one of the topics that comes up a lot is wisdom. Has the aging seafarer gained wisdom? How has he done so? And again, as I mentioned before, this concept of righteousness, of what it means to live a good life. It's also sometimes treated as an allegory. There are some scholars who argue that this is sort of a penitential journey of a sinner, where the sinner moves kind of from reveling in their sin through penitence and then into righteousness at the end of the story. There's also a psychological allegorical reading where the seafarer kind of goes through several psychological changes, and the settings of sea and land sort of stand for different states of being, either a static state of being that is safe but unpleasant, or a mutable state of being which is psychologically dangerous but much more exciting. It's a little bit of a stretch, but that's just the way that some people have interpreted it. Again, your mileage will vary. All interpretations are valid as long as they're grounded in the text. Finally, you will notice again that this poem relies really heavily on the motif of wilderness versus community, which is something that we saw really obviously in Beowulf with kind of, Grendel versus Heorot as well. So that's basically what The Seafarer is about. Those are some of your interpretive options that I'd like for you to keep in mind as you read. The other poem you'll read is much shorter, and it's called The Wife's Lament, and it is my personal favorite of the Old English poems. I think it is such a joy and also such a wild puzzle. It's an incredibly well-preserved poem. If you remember back when we read Sappho, there were all of these poems that just had huge chunks taken out of them that we can sometimes speculate what words and phrases to put there, but more often we just have to put in like an ellipsis and say, well, it's the best we have. The Wife's Lament is incredibly complete by comparison, and it uses just this heart-wrenching language, this incredibly evocative language. It's full of detail, of emotion, of just, heart-wrenching grief. And that's why I love it so much. I love a good sad story. So the Wife's Lament is usually interpreted as an elegy, or in German what's called a Frauenlied. Now, a Frauenlied is a woman's song. That's literally what it means. And it's a genre of song that is a lament for a lost lover. Now, this poem is often interpreted on a literal level, where it is the story of a woman who, her man is involved in some kind of feud, and she has had to run away to the wilds in order to be safe, while her man, her husband, her lover, whoever he is kind of fighting in this feud. And there's discussion of a child, and there may or may not be kind of this other male figure involved somehow. But because there is so much kind of vagueness to the specifics of this narrative situation, it's opened up a ton of space for these other interpretations. There are so many. Some of them say that it's a riddle, in the way that, the Exeter book is full of riddles. Some people interpret the Wife's Lament as a further riddle, and their argument is mostly based on the structure of the text rather than its contents, which is an interesting read. Again, this is a poem that's often read allegorically, where the speaker is sort of seen to represent like the bride of Christ figure, who is, waiting or in mourning for her lover, who would, I suppose in this reading, be Christ. So that's an option. It also may represent a similar metaphysical journey to the Seafarer, wherein there is this sort of psychological aspect where the speaker must move from a place of grief psychologically to a place of understanding or of acceptance. There's also and it's not on this list here, but there is sort of a more feminist interpretation where because of kind of the early English sort of gender restrictions, that just the act of speaking is sort of almost transgressive act for a female speaker, but one that gives her enormous power because speech itself can be an act of power. And more so, depending on how you read it, this text can either seem very sort of polite and sort of long-suffering, but it can also seem extremely angry. And so if you follow the angry reading of the text, her tone and the fact that she is actively taking a position of power through speech can almost be seen as an act of cursing, which was a huge deal in the early medieval period. They took things like curses extremely seriously, partially because of their interpretation of the Bible, but also partially because of the way that they had converted from kind of the Germanic pagan religions that also had some very intense feelings about curses. There is also a strain of interpretation that suggests that the speaker in the wife's lament is not a woman at all, but is in fact a male speaker who is lamenting his lost love. And there is some evidence to suggest this. In Old English, the adjectives and the pronouns and things are used with a feminine voice, but the argument for a male speaker largely comes out of some of the types of relationships that are described that seem to have a more martial or traditionally homosocial aspect to them. And the concept of using female pronouns is seen by some scholars to be not a gendered process so much as one that denotes a sense of taking a submissive position in a relationship. So that's another interpretation. And finally, you'll read that there are several male figures in the text, and some scholars have suggested that this is because there are actually multiple lovers in the story, which, complicates the narrative. So just like with the seafarer, your mileage may vary. You may even have your own interpretation, and I'm really excited to have the chance to hear about them a little bit. But let's see. For now, I will leave it here. If you have questions, please let me know as always.